Labuga. So it's amazing, actually, how much there really is in terms of lowland tropical rainforest. And remember, even as we move closer to Colombo, even in the Colombo metropolitan area, we have remnant protected areas that display lowland forest types, wet zone forest types specifically. And I think this is important. I'm not going to mention it because what Urban Fishing Cat and SCAR are doing is basically showcasing how even within the Colombo metropolitan area, our largest city suburban conglomeration, there are still wetlands, lowland wet zone forest types, and other wilderness, fragmented wilderness areas that hold a variety when it comes to ecological diversity. So there is a lot. And I think for our audience today, what we need to understand is that Singaraja's expansion basically secured, if we look at Singaraja now, it basically secured 12 other state forests that bordered the original Singaraja. For example, if we look at this section of Singaraja here, the Morapiti-Runakanda sector, that was an other state forest for about 40, 50 years. And finally, we can make it accessible to properly controlled and regulated ecotourism, and at the same time ensure that proper, scientifically driven, data-heavy conservation research programs are conducted to restore Western Singaraja. Because Morapiti-Runakanda was a section of Western Singaraja that people ignored for years. And as as you can see on my map, there are still small settlements legally inside Morapiti-Runakanda. There's a road that goes right through it. And there's a lot of fragmentation. But now that it is a part of Singaraja, we have an opportunity to really understand the full extent of Singaraja. And even to the north of Singaraja, as you leave the lower submontane zone, there is a love. You can actually see this, by the way, when you head on the Ratnapura road, when you're heading towards Uddawala Way, or when you're heading towards Ohia and towards Samanalawa as well, called Kiribati. And Kiribati is a submontane other state forest that, although heavily fragmented, you can see just how old these forests are, yet little to no research has been done. So there is a lot of lowland tropical rainforest and submontane constituted protected areas available. And I think the sooner we realize that we have so much, the more public awareness can be raised and more pressure can be brought to conserving lowland tropical rainforests in Sri Lanka. So I hope that answers that question. I'm going to stop sharing for now.
Yes, thank you. In fact, even I didn't know about all these other protected areas, and I do know now. Are they all open to the public?
No, I will admit the majority aren't. Singaraja is. Singaraja has multiple entrances, including what many people will be aware of, the main entrance in Kudawa, Kalawana, Advagala, that area. But Singaraja does have multiple other entrances as well. Kannelia is open, as I said earlier. Yagirala is also open to the general public. And some of these protected areas like Ramalakanda, you can visit the peripheries and get an idea of what they are. But for the most part, I will admit that they are closed to the general public. So that does make promoting an ecotourism agenda difficult. So one thing I could potentially request from everybody who's tuned in today, if there are people who are interested in promoting lowland tropical rainforest protected areas and submontane forest protected areas, and making sure that it's an inclusive, from the gazetting and the legislative perspective, to the ecotourism perspective, to the scientifically driven and data-heavy research process, if people are happy to promote those processes, then I think we can build quite significant public pressure to use ecotourism and data-driven research and science to save these closed rainforest protected areas. Because whatever said or done, our people are in a bad way at the moment due to the plethora of economic issues, and it's got even worse thanks to COVID-19. So one thing about protected areas is they have to be economically viable, especially for local communities that live on the peripheries of these protected areas. It has to be economically viable. Otherwise, there's no point. Because whatever we do, given the lack of practical enforcement and the lack of financing for government entities that handle protected areas, we will see a lot more damage done before we can bring it under control. So we have to make protected areas economically viable. That is a fact.
Thank you, John. And you also mentioned about the rainforest flora and fauna. Could you just highlight a few unique species that occur mainly in the lowland tropical wet zone? If you could touch on a few that people may be unaware of, even if you could focus on some small carnivores, even small wildcats, and the habitats that they might occupy.
Yeah. So again, this is a very, very, very expansive area. I'll start with a bit of almost an unofficial flagship species. And it's not a species that you'd normally think of when we talk about protected areas and what they have to offer. But at the same time, when I say the name, I think a lot of people will recognize what I'm talking about. But at the same time, again, it's not the kind of species that gets everybody's attention straight away. So let's start with, again, there's so many species that I could potentially start off with. But okay, fine. Let's make this simple. Let's start with our Sri Lanka blue magpie. So the Sri Lanka blue magpie is a country endemic, listed as vulnerable as per the IUCN's list of threatened species, and only found in the most pristine lowland tropical rainforests in Sri Lanka. Now, the blue magpie was made famous by the fact that a lot of ornithologists and a lot of avifaunal enthusiasts went to Singaraja and started really exploring and opening up the possibility of scientific research for Singaraja's many bird waves. And in that way, the blue magpie became an unofficial, well, a mascot for Singaraja, I suppose, in one sense, because it represents a uniqueness about or associated with our lowland tropical rainforests. And there's a linkage there as well, because without our lowland tropical rainforest, there's a very good chance that the Sri Lanka blue magpie will just go extinct altogether. It is heavily interlinked with the ecosystem that it lives in. So that's just one example of species. I mean, there are so many others. I guess another species that I myself was actually only more recently made aware of, and this was because I had actually been sent some research on it. And at the time, I didn't know what to say when I found this out. But it turns out that the herpetological importance of Singaraja is probably the one thing that will define Singaraja in years to come, if nothing else. Because let's face it, Singaraja and other lowland tropical rainforests do not display terrestrial big five. Not to the degree that we fantasize and obsessively photograph in the dry zone. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Citizen participation through wildlife photography is probably one of the reasons why the dry zone has so much attention drawn to it. But it's a lot harder in the wet zone. If we're talking about terrestrial big five in the wet zone, the only examples left really in the lowland wet zone would be the Sri Lankan leopard and the two remaining rainforest elephants, Sri Lankan rainforest elephants, were left in Singaraja. It gets a bit more convoluted as you go up towards the Central Highlands, but for the purposes of clarity, we'll leave out the bit about the Central Highlands for now. So having said that though, aside from a study that was conducted, and this was research based off camera trap evidence conducted by the Wildlife Conservation Society of Gaul a few years ago. Aside from that, there is virtually nothing known about the Sri Lankan leopard in our lowland tropical rainforests. It's amazing, actually. And this is the one place that successive conservationists for decades have declared as the place where the largest percentage of black leopards is found in Sri Lanka. Now, we don't actually have any actual detailed scientific evidence to support this, but given the amount of carcasses that have appeared over the years on the peripheries of Singaraja, it's not a hard stretch to say that if the right research was done, we could potentially back up some of the claims that are being made about Singaraja. Same for the lowland tropical rainforests, the elephants specifically. I will share, if I can, I will share a statistic that I came across with regard to lowland tropical rainforest elephants. If I can find it, give me one sec. So this image here, 2.6, the human-elephant conflict. It reads that Sri Lanka has the highest density, but also poses the biggest challenge for conservation management where wild elephants are concerned. And it makes a point that historically, Sri Lanka's lowland tropical rainforest and submontane forest recorded the largest distribution and numbers of wild elephants, not the dry zone. The dry zone is where we traditionally associate the great elephant gathering at Minneria, Kaudal, and Hurulu, and just the overall highest density of elephants. But historically, there's evidence to suggest that actually this was not the case. So the loss of wild elephants in the dry zone is probably a fundamental factor that will need to be reversed in the coming years. However, it's not the only thing. Because remember, without that diversity that we consistently talk about in lowland tropical rainforests, especially around amphibians and reptiles, we are basically shooting ourselves in the foot with where understanding is concerned for lowland tropical rainforests. And that's a shame, because we don't want to have a situation where we have so much and then lose it just because we weren't willing to put the effort in to ensure that comprehensive, scientifically driven, data-heavy research is conducted to ensure that we fully understand what our lowland tropical rainforests have to offer. Now, going back to the example that I was going to talk about earlier, there is an endemic lizard in Sri Lanka that only recently had any real data done on it. And the reason why I'm picking this example is because the lizard in question, the rough-nosed horn lizard, is distributed predominantly and almost exclusively now in Sri Lanka's lowland tropical rainforests. Yet the rough-nosed horn lizard is not known to anybody. But it displays a connection with the lowland tropical rainforest in terms of its behavioral patterns, its migratory, its travel habits, how it feeds, how it interacts with the overall environment, that we just don't understand, and we're only in the process of understanding now. And there are so many examples of this. I mean, there are fellow researchers and fellow scientists and friends of mine who have done the most incredible amphibian-based research in Eastern Singaraja. And Eastern Singaraja truly is an amphibian hotspot. You just have to go on Instagram and look at some of the amphibian fauna that has been photographed in Eastern Singaraja. And you just start to realize that it's a gold mine. And it's such a shame that lowland tropical rainforests just don't get that level of attention. So even in the context of small carnivores, jungle cat, fishing cat, even rusty spotted cat, very much present in our lowland tropical rainforest. Minimal to no research done on them, but they're there. And as we saw with BBC's cute little video clip about a rusty spotted cat who was rehabilitated in the vicinity of one of our lowland tropical rainforests, it really goes to just elaborate the fact that we have so much more to understand about the ancient connectivity and ecological significance of these lowland tropical rainforests. But it isn't just about individual habitats. These are collective ecosystems that take us, it's almost like a window into time. And that window is unfortunately being lost because we haven't yet figured out that what needs to happen for lowland tropical rainforest to survive is research and associated ecological components. Ecotourism will only serve to help conserve these lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests. But without actually understanding it, we can't make the necessary policy decision that we need to actually save these beautiful, beautiful ancient forests in Sri Lanka. I hope that answers that question. I can go into a lot more detail, but I have a feeling we'd be here all night if we were to talk about it.
That was a lot of information. But regarding the small wild cats, though, I just want to know what's your opinion on highlighting and using them as a flagship species with the intention of conserving these lowland tropical rainforests?
I'm glad you asked that, Anjali. I think that small cats, small wild cats, and other wild carnivores, small carnivores, should very much be highlighted because we need to understand what their role is in a lowland tropical rainforest. Even now, we don't have a clue of how jungle cats and fishing cats operate in our lowland tropical rainforest. We have no idea as to the populations. We don't know how they behave. We don't know what their feeding habits are like. We don't know what the percentage is in terms of operation versus, diurnal versus nocturnal, whether they operate mostly in the day or in the night. We don't know what their prey base is. So that alone could really contribute to taking research for lowland tropical rainforests forward. And the other thing about small wildcats, and this is something that I only realized more recently, is that small wildcats are actually so much more in tune with the sensitivities of a lowland tropical rainforest. That's the difference with large predators. Large predators, they're a part of it, but they're also a very independent part of it just because of what they are. That's why we term megafauna as megafauna, and that's why we have a terrestrial big five. But small fauna, especially wildcats, are so sensitive to the changes in ecosystems and habitats, but they also show a remarkable resilience and adaptability. We've seen this through urban fishing cats' work. The urban fishing cat population in Colombo, which is still technically a lowland wet zone environment, has yielded incredible results about just how complex fishing cats in the Colombo metropolitan area are. So you can imagine in a protected area that's outside a metropolitan area, such as Singaraja or Carnelia, just the diversity of the topical areas that we discussed in relation to small carnivores. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so thank you. We're getting a whole bunch of questions down, so be prepared in a few minutes to answer them all. So could you tell us a little more about these government entities that are working together to protect these forests, a bit about national policies? We can touch on that as being maybe the last topic because we are sort of running out of time.
Sure. All right. I won't make this too detailed, but I'll touch on the framework that is available for the protection of lowland tropical rainforests. So the majority of lowland tropical rainforests in Sri Lanka, I would estimate at about 90%, is under the Department of Forest Conservation. That is a fact. DFC has control of our lowland tropical rainforests. There's only a very small balance that falls with the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and an even tinier balance that falls with the Central Environmental Authority. So the protected areas under the Department of Forest Conservation that we refer to are the conservation forests, the reserved forests, forest reserves, and there are provisions for village forests, but none of those have actually been officially declared yet. Now, just to contextualize, what I mean by these specific protected areas is protected areas under the Forest Conservation Ordinance. And the Forest Conservation Ordinance is the piece of legislation that governs DFC's activities. What I find interesting about the lack of village forests is, actually speaking, especially in the wet zone, the concept of a Candian home garden could be fully translated into a village forest if we were to actually gazette such village forests into existence. Because village forests are non-traditional types of protected areas. And if these non-traditional types of protected areas, which actually promote sustainable resource extraction and community participation, are gazetted in the proposed buffer zones of Singaraja, these village forests would create their own barrier for protected areas such as Singaraja, Kanneliya, Ramanlakanda, Yagirala. And that in itself is a potential solution to solving the long-term degradation that lowland tropical rainforest protected areas display on a regular basis. So that's the Department of Forest Conservation. But then the Department of Wildlife Conservation does have a few protected areas. I think one that maybe I should highlight, just so the audience today is aware, is one that once again is in the Western Province. It was originally an estate, but it was an estate that somehow protected a very fragmented percentage of lowland tropical rainforest. So I'm also going to pull up the official map for this small protected area, just to give you an idea that it's not about size when it comes to protected areas. True enough, everybody's awed by the fact that, oh, Singaraja is now 4 times the size, and oh, Yala and Wilpattu are amongst our 2 largest protected areas. But it's not just about that. There has to be an understanding that even the smallest protected areas contribute to ecological diversity. So let me share my screen and introduce you to Horrigola National Park, a tiny lowland tropical rainforest protected area located in the Western Province that still displays a remarkable resilience and a remarkable example of diversity. And this little national park is probably one of the only reasons why that in the wet zone, aside from Labugama, that we can still be afforded the ability to study lowland tropical rainforest in the Western Province. And just think about that. The Western Province, for the most part, doesn't have much in terms of wilderness. The biggest wilderness prior to the current Gazette of Singaraja was the fact that Morapitia Runakam, there was another state forest that just happened to be in the Western Provincial, Southern Provincial boundaries. But aside from that, we barely have anything in the Western Province in terms of lowland tropical rainforests. But this little national park is definitely one of those aspects. So that's probably an example of the Department of Wildlife Conservation. Now, what you have to understand is that the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance is unfortunately geared more towards protected areas in the dry zone. For whatever reason, the Department of Wildlife Conservation, through historical factors and what has happened in recent years, focuses on the big protected areas in the dry zone. But we have, I know because I have personally pushed the Department of Wildlife Conservation to get more actively involved in the wet zone. Because unfortunately, I'm talking from a parliamentary legislative framework, the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance remains fundamentally the single strongest piece of parliamentary legislation for protected areas of any kind in Sri Lanka. We cannot deny or dispute that. Practical application, financing, and manpower issues aside, the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance is stronger than the National Environmental Act. And the National Environmental Act is supposed to be the definitive overarching piece of parliamentary legislation. So there is scope for the Department of Wildlife Conservation to get involved in the protection of lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests in Sri Lanka. Because the other thing is the Department of Forest Conservation has this bad habit. And this actually stems from back when they were just the Forest Department before the 2013 mandate change from FD to DFC. A lot of their lowland tropical rainforest protected areas continue to remain in proposed status. Kiribatkala is one example that I showed you. Let me actually show you another example that's even more concerning for the purposes of Singaraja. So this other state forest highlighted in yellow here is the Kudumiria other state forest. Now, 2 things were supposed to happen for this. One, it was supposed to be absorbed into the new Singaraja Gazette because it's effectively surrounded by Singaraja's new boundaries. You can see the Valankanda sector of Singaraja in the north and the main body of Singaraja in the south. Yet it wasn't for whatever reason. And now we're having to push to try and get DFC to gazette it as a conservation forest to save what little is left. Because unfortunately, when you take the polygon of Kudumiria away, there are examples of quite severe devastation. Nobody's denying this. Okay, you can see it for yourself. It's there. But that doesn't mean we have to give up on areas like this. through proper policy planning, land use development plans, and associated strategies, we can really turn the tide on these improper land use strategies that are being used to desecrate lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests in Sri Lanka. But Kudumiri isn't the only one. There's quite a few that continue to remain in proposed status and have remained for years. And for whatever reason, they still are not being gazetted. So another example, highlighted in blue here, is the Berelia Kudagala of the state forest. And similarly, if we move slightly more south towards Mathura, we have the Berelia Akuressa of the state forest. So there is a weakness where the Forest Conservation Ordinance is concerned and where practical application by the Department of Forest Conservation is, in relation to that. But the overarching policies that govern it need to be properly amended. The National Forest Policy, the National Wildlife Policy, the National Wetland Policy, and a whole load of other associated national policies need to be properly implemented through a regulatory framework. Similarly, the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance, not so much, but the Forest Conservation Ordinance definitely is in due of a major update. Both pieces of parliamentary legislation were updated in 2009. And since then, that last update, there has been no work on either pieces of parliamentary legislation. And finally, for the institutional framework, for the first time in 15 years, we have DWC and DFC under one cabinet ministry. But the problem is, now that there's a state ministry involved, there's a bit of a disconnect between the policy guidance role played by the Cabinet Ministry of Wildlife and Forest Conservation and the State Ministry of Wildlife Conservation and Forest Resources Development. So there is a massive, massive institutional framework. And we could be talking about this all day, to be honest. But obviously, for the purposes of time, we don't need to go into that now. But I hope that clarifies which government entities are associated with lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests. I'll show you one more example before I forget. There is a submontane forest that borders peak wilderness close to Ratnapura called Eratna Gilimale. And again, Eratna Gilimale is pure submontane forest. Yet this being a submontane forest, despite being declared some 50 years ago, has still not been officially demarcated, declared, and gazetted as a protected area. And that to me is terrifying. Because Eratna Gilimale, aside from Eastern Singaraja, represents one of the most fundamentally important submontane forest patches in Sri Lanka. And we really need to look at aiming pressure, or at least working with the government entities, specifically DWC and DFC, to get these protected areas gazetted, on track, and as per the suggestions that I mentioned earlier for ecotourism and scientifically driven research. So I hope that answers the point, and I hope I wasn't waffling for too long. Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for that plethora of information, and I'm pretty sure you could go on about this, as you said, but that we will definitely save for another amazing discussion. There are some great questions here that we need answering. So let's start with the most recent one. So if there is such a scope for research and a need for it to back up conservation efforts, why is there such dearth for it?
That's a very, it's a great question, but it's a question that has no clear answer. Okay, let me elaborate on what I mean by that. So this scope for research and the need to back it up with conservation efforts is basically hampered by the fact that the public view of lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests is minimal. Because the public view, and that's actually, oddly enough, it's skewed by the mere fact that these lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests don't display terrestrial big five. Because everybody loves going after megafauna. That's why national parks are so popular. Let's face it. Yala National Park Block 1 is the destination in Sri Lanka to see large megafauna. So it's hampered by public perception. And it's also hampered by the fact that the central government mechanism uses that hampering to not engage and not promote the necessary research and scope for conservation related initiatives. That is a responsibility of the central government, but they're just not doing it for whatever reason. And we all know how the central government in Sri Lanka behaves anyway when it comes to conservation. I don't think that needs any introduction there. We just need to look at Government Circular number 1 of 2020, which scrapped Government Circular number 5 of 2001 and placed all other state forests and state forested lands under district and divisional secretariats, removing them from the control of the Department of Forest Conservation, and allowing the Ministry of Lands and all the government entities under the Ministry of Lands to retain control of undeclared state forested lands. So it has to be a lot more wildlife, forestry, environmentally conservation oriented in terms of agenda. That's just a reality. Otherwise, this dirt that is being mentioned for such activities in the wet zone is going to continue 10, 20 years down the line. And that is not going to benefit anyone. I hope that answers the question.
That was from Shavinder Sanaika. He got his answer. The next one is actually from Tanugar. Yes. So his one is quite fun. Hi John, how rare are sloth bears in our wet zone? I'm asking this because there was footage of sloth bears from India in mountain/highland.
Okay, so thank you for that question. That question is again a bit more gray. It's not so black and white. Now, what I mean by that is that historically, there's very little data-driven evidence to show that sloth bears occupied the wet zone of Sri Lanka. But it's not conclusive, it's not definitive. It doesn't say that there weren't ever Sri Lankan sloth bears in our lowland tropical rainforest and in the wet zone in general. But based on what more recently, I'd say within the last 100 years or maybe 150 years, sloth bears have, for whatever reason, been absent from the combined wet zone, whether it's the lowland wet zone, the sub-montane areas, the montane areas, even the upper montane areas. Sloth bears are absent. That's a fact. Sloth bears we now almost exclusively orient or associate with the dry zone. So sloth bears in the wet zone is something that I think needs a lot more research done. I think it's important to compile whatever historical evidence that we may be able to come across to find out conclusively once and for all if there were sloth bears in our wet zone. Because the question highlights a fundamental point that in India's lowland tropical rainforest and other associated highland wet zone forest types, there are sloth bears. So I guess one thing could be circumstance. The other thing could be geological conditions. The third could be anthropogenic activities. And the fourth could be just a natural degradation in population. We don't actually know because, again, the sloth bear has been very poorly researched, our Sri Lankan sloth bear. And the majority of that research has been done in Yala, Wilpattu, and to a lesser extent in Vaskam, in those national parks in the dry zone. But I can conclusively say that in recent history, sloth bears have not occupied our wet zone. I'll leave it at that. I hope that answered the question.
Okay. So there's one from Shakti Meki. Would you say that most of the policies made in regards to the lowland tropical rainforests are data-driven or more so based on intuition and past experience of these ecosystems?
Not really. Answering that question has to look at the history of national policies and parliamentary legislation. So the Department of Forest Conservation, everybody still knows them as the Forest Department, but I don't actually think people know why they know it as just the Forest Department, as opposed to the Department of Forest Conservation following the 2013 mandate change. And that is because the policy-driven framework of national policies and associated legislation, even the Forest Conservation Ordinance, until the 2009 amendment, the Forest Conservation Ordinance was just known as the Forest Ordinance, not the Forest Conservation Ordinance. So in response to that question, I would say that actually, the policies made in regards to lowland tropical rainforests are data-driven based on utilization and not necessarily sustainable utilization either of these lowland tropical rainforests. Because in the past, lowland tropical rainforest and actually any forest type that was under the the current Forest Conservation Ordinance, or then Forest Ordinance, were used more for sustainable resource extraction, agroforestry, analog forestry, community forestry, and sustainable agricultural techniques, including home gardens as well. So those policies promoted resource extraction. They did not promote conservation. And even after the 2013 mandate change, when the Forest Department finally became the Department of Forest Conservation, there still was a lesser move towards understanding how conservation-driven data analysis and acquisition should be used to correct the course, the faulted course that we initially went for lowland tropical rainforests in Sri Lanka. Again, I hope that makes sense, but I'm willing to clarify if there's any further comments on that.
There's actually a cool one too. Are there any conifers naturally found in Sri Lanka?
Okay, to answer that. I think that, okay, I think the best way to, okay, just repeat the question just so I can formulate it in my head.
Are conifers naturally found in Sri Lanka?
Yes, they are. In wet zone ecosystems in particular, because you have to understand that wet zone ecosystems in Sri Lanka display a variety that is not comprehended by current scientific standards. Honestly, one of the biggest reasons why we are so scared of what's going to happen to the wet zone is because one of the newest threats facing flora in particular is biopiracy. Major pharmaceutical companies and multinationals are looking at actually acquiring and researching and profiting off the extensive diversity of flora in our lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests. And until we understand it fully, we ourselves can't do the necessary to protect what that has left. So I think there needs to be a fundamental change in the way we approach such aspects of lowland tropical rainforests. I hope that makes sense.
So another one is, will abandoned plantations spring back to their original form over time, or are they permanently damaged?
Ooh, okay. If we're being honest, for the most part, if it's an oil palm plantation, they won't bounce back. If it's a rubber plantation, they will bounce back, but it'll take centuries worth to get to secondary stage and even longer to get to a primary stage. So plantation forest is dependent. It's dependent on what the plantation forest is, what effect that has had on the soil content and the concentrations of minerals within said soil, and how the immediate water table has been affected by said plantations. We can restore, but it'll take a long time, even with the rubber forest. More so with tea, and almost maybe not with oil palm plantations. But as I said, oil palm plantations are now banned in Sri Lanka. So that, in theory, takes one component straight off the table.
So somebody asked, what's the recommended level of percentage of this forest by area of Sri Lanka for it to be considered as healthy?
Again, we don't really have, okay, let me rephrase that. We don't have a means of assessing what constitutes a collective healthiness for lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests. What I will say is we need to strive for stronger targets. So to answer that question in a more broad perspective, if we aim for 40% forest cover in Sri Lanka, regardless of the protected area type, but remember, it doesn't have to be strict protection. It can be conservation driven, it can be ecotourism driven, it can be community participation driven, it can be resource extraction driven. It doesn't have to be strict conservation necessarily, because strict conservation won't work in the current context of Sri Lanka. So if we aim for a collective 40% for the island, then by default, the lowland tropical rainforest and submontane forest collective percentages will rise to a much quote unquote healthier level than they are at the moment. Having said that, for submontane forests, I would like to see at least 1% of the country covered in submontane forests. That would be really nice, because 0.43% is a very alarming statistic. So that would be ideal, at least to get that to 1%, and maybe for our lowland tropical rainforests, just to figure off the top of my head, 5%. These are not conclusive figures. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Someone has another question about what the update on the protection of our watershed areas, that is the catchment for the 103 river basin system.
So, okay, this is a two-part question answer. The majority of our 103 rivers start their lives in the central highlands of Sri Lanka. That is very much a given. But there are a few. And these are not necessarily big rivers. These are maybe second-tier rivers, smaller ones, and streams that do start their lives in our lowland tropical rainforests. What has been made less apparent is the fact that although we have 4 national policies, including one in draft phase and one that has been released, concerning the preservation of the catchment areas of water sources in Sri Lanka, the connection has not been made that it has to be done in tandem with protected area management. So those two areas are still far apart, as opposed to coming together. So water catchment preservation is fundamental, especially for any wet zone forest, whether it's our lowland tropical rainforest, the submontane forest, or everything that you find in the central highlands. But just to answer that question, the importance remains 100%, maybe even more. Because the rivers that do start in our lowland tropical rainforests do lead to some of the bigger river systems in the country. And I think that in itself is important to understand, because that way we know what the secondary importance or the conjoined importance of our lowland tropical rainforests is.
Thank you, John, for answering all these really good questions from everybody. And thank you for sending in these questions. And if we haven't answered anything, guys, we will answer them on our social media page and post them for you. So thank you again, John.
Anjali, I just noticed that there's one question that has been asked about Cannelia. I think I'm just going to quickly answer that because I figured this would come up. Yeah.
Yeah, about protected areas again and public areas.
So to answer the Cannelia question first, I do agree that protected areas, even under the Department of Forest Conservation, should be opened up for ecotourism. Because whatever said or done before the oil palm ban came into place, Western Cannelia was being hammered by oil palm plantations. Let me actually quickly show that before we conclude the session. So what we see here, close to the Cannelia boundary and buffer zone, is basically evidence of land clearing and the implementation of oil palm galore. You can see the oil palm. It takes up mountains of land. It's everywhere. And this was starting to encroach into the Cannelia boundary. In fact, it already has in some areas. So now this is also a side effect of the fact that the Cannelia boundaries haven't been secured properly, unlike the Singaraja boundaries, because DFC is also hampered by manpower shortages, financing, and other negative factors that affect it. But the point is that if Dadiagala and Nakia, then if those two protected areas, the entire forest complex was opened up to the general public for ecotourism, that would go a long way to changing public sentiment and the political angle that always comes into play towards preserving the entirety of Cannelia. Because let's face it, Cannelia, Dadiagala, and Nakia, then in this forest complex is 116 square kilometers. It's a huge chunk of lowland tropical rainforest. And it's only lowland tropical rainforest, unlike Singaraja. So that makes it even more unique. So yes, it would help with protection, but it would have to see viable ecotourism that is controlled and properly managed and doesn't become like Yala National Park Block 1, which anyway it can't because it's walking and hiking safaris there versus vehicular safari jeeps. But we also have to appreciate that these ecosystems are very sensitive. And we can't compromise the integrity of these ecosystems for ecotourism alone. In fact, what I think is that conservation-driven data and research should be done in parallel the moment an area becomes open for ecotourism. And even before that, the groundwork should be laid for research and data-driven analysis on these protected areas. And also, just to answer that question about lowland tropical rainforest and submontane forest being considered as protected areas, basically yes, because there are many that have been gazetted, but there are also a huge number that have not been gazetted that remain as other state forests and state forested lands.
I just have one question before we finish off. So how can all contribute to the conservation of these forests? I mean, you represent rainforest protectors of Sri Lanka. So how could we all get involved to contribute to the conservation of these places?
So I think the first thing is visiting the protected areas that are available, publicly accessible. Taking pictures, documenting, recording, gathering evidence, monitoring, assisting the Department of Forest Conservation, assisting the Department of Wildlife Conservation in any way that you can. You don't have to be a scientist or a researcher, because there are people who are going to engage in those fields. But even from the most simple perspective, you can get involved in raising awareness, and raising awareness is critical to the future of lowland tropical rainforest and submontane forests in Sri Lanka. What Rainforest Protectors of Sri Lanka does is policy-driven, research-supported, evidence-based work, which includes restoration of periphery areas of lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests. So Rainforest Protectors of Sri Lanka has a restoration site, a reforestation site, a number of reforestation sites actually, but the biggest one is in the the northeastern section of Singaraja, in the eastern sector, close to the town of Rakwana, right in the buffer zone, just above the boundary actually, and right next to the buffer zone. So for those who are feeling adventurous, you could always participate in that. It's 2-3 days of roughing it out on the edge of a lowland tropical rainforest protected area and engaging in ecosystem restoration at the most fundamental level. And remember, this is ecosystem restoration that is sanctioned by the Department of Forest Conservation. So as long as you're not too squirmy and can put up with the leeches, which you wouldn't get in the dry zone, I think you'll be okay. And I think you can really get involved in that. And then the other thing is just helping national environmental organizations like rainforest protectors, engaging and providing evidence of any destruction that is taking place. The more knowledge and the more intelligence networks we have, the more we can do and the more we can help DWC and DFC do their work as well.
Thank you, John. And most of all, thank you for highlighting the importance of small cats and how they utilize these different habitats today as well. And speaking of not being a scientist and wanting to be involved, we've got a page on STAR Citizen Science Program where people can report sightings and incidents. So just go on to Small Cat Advocacy and Research's page, go to the Get Involved section, and there you have the part where you can report a sighting. So just thought I'd mention that for anyone who has any more questions, please send them to us even on our STAR page or even to the Rainforest Protectors page, and we will answer them and post them on our stories for you. So thank you again, John, for joining us and sharing all of this important information. I learned a great deal. I'm pretty sure the entire audience did too, and we really appreciate it. Hope we can do this again.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Anjali. Thank you very much to Anya, to Urban Fishing Cat, and to Ska as well for facilitating today's session. I really appreciate it. This session was actually done in light of World Rainforest Day, which occurred on the 22nd of on the 22nd of this month, and we weren't able to do it on that day, but we figured that on a Friday evening we would get a really good session out there for lowland tropical rainforests in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much once again to everybody who came and listened today. I hope it made sense what I said, and if anybody wants to follow up, please do. Rainforest Protectors of Sri Lanka has an Instagram account and a Facebook page as well. So Please do follow up if you have any questions, and we would love to work with everybody who really wants to get involved in ensuring the future of our lowland tropical rainforests and submontane forests in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much once again, everybody.
Also, for everyone who is interested in any more information about small cats, do follow Open Fishing Cat and Safe Fishing Cat on Instagram and Facebook as well. A lot of information on the current research being done is on there. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.